Hello and welcome to James and Fabian's presentation on conflicting macroeconomic objectives. Today we are looking at economic growth versus inflation. Just firstly, a bit of history on economic growth. First, we should define it though, as that's what you'll have to do in your exam. First off, you have to define key terms.
You sure will, Creed.
Economic growth is an increase in the amount of goods and services produced in an economy in a given period of time. What's the definition for inflation, Fabian?
Well, Creed, inflation. An increase in general price level of goods and services in an economy.
Thank you. So, a brief history of economic growth in the UK. The UK doesn't actually have an explicit target for economic growth. However, it is roughly 2.5%. And as the diagram below shows, aggregate demand growth equals aggregate supply growth as well. This is a history of UK economic growth since 1979 up until 2012. As we can see, the recent recession post-2008.
Economic history inflation. The UK has an inflation target of around 2%, plus or minus 1%. The job of meeting this target was handed over to the Monetary Policy Committee in the Bank of England in 1998. For 5 years, there was a target of 2.5%, before it was changed to 2% in 2003.
This is the history of UK inflation. As we see, very rarely is it actually on the 2% target.
Very rarely.
So, what's the relationship between output gaps and inflation? Output gaps are when the short-run national equilibrium is not in tandem with long-run aggregate supply curve. So before we look at the conflict between these two policy objectives, let us first look at the link between output gaps and inflation. We've already seen a diagram where aggregate supply equals aggregate demand. But what if an economy is growing to such an extent that aggregate demand grows faster than aggregate supply? This is shown in the diagram. Short-term national equilibrium is in front of long-run aggregate supply. But because supply cannot stay ahead of its long-run curve, eventually it shifts to the left, to the long-run equilibrium point. This is point B on the diagram. The new national equilibrium is at a higher price, but there is no increased output. This is the biggest danger of having a positive output gap.
In some circumstances, after a recession, there will be a negative output gap where short-run national equilibrium is less than the long-run aggregate supply curve. There is a spare capacity in the economy as shown in the diagram. In this situation, the economy can grow faster than the long-run trend rate without causing inflation. For example, after the recession of 1991 to 92, we had a growth of 4% year. This is evident in the diagram, where the demand is growing a lot, but price remains at the same level due to the spare capacity in the economy.
So now on to the conflicts between inflation and economic growth. What's the problem then? Well, the root of the conflict derives from the simple fact that as demand increases, prices go up. This is evident in the diagram. As demand, although the labels are actually on the other way around here, but as demand increases from the lower curve to the upper, price will go up. The supply and demand diagram shows in the short run a higher GDP equates to higher prices. As mentioned earlier, this situation can be worsened when demand outgrows supply in the long run, which will lead to stagflation. Prices are rising, but the economy isn't growing. What are the problems then with policy? Well, a 2% rate of inflation is not very high. So if the economy is growing, the government will need to counteract this inflationary pressure using either contractionary fiscal or monetary policy. The former will decrease aggregate demand, curbing the increase in price level. as shown on the supply and demand graph here. The latter will reduce the supply of money in the economy and increase the value of money. This decreases inflation as each pound is worth more. And the diagram shows how a higher interest rate, contractionary monetary policy, equals a lower quantity of money in the economy, and therefore it has a higher value. However, the government has to be careful. Whilst these policies are effective in reducing short-term demand and reducing inflation, if they go on for too long, the long-run supply will decrease and economic growth will be affected. Here the diagram shows a shifting to the left of the aggregate supply. It is imperative that long-term supply isn't reduced by contractionary policy because, as highlighted earlier, this enhances the chances of a short-term positive output gap, which will eventually lead to inflation but no economic growth.
Another problem occurs when a government is trying to shift its long-run supply curve to the right. If inflation is too high, this is a good way of decreasing it. However, unless extreme structural reform takes place, this shifting of the supply curve can be achieved by fiscal stimulus. In the long run, this will increase the economy's capacity and decrease inflation. But in the short run, there is a very real risk that the increase in supply as a result of the stimulus will lag behind the increase in demand, stoking inflation in the short term. Having said that, if the fiscal stimulus is implemented correctly and efficiently, and productivity increases, perhaps by the use of supply-side policy, then short-run supply will increase, and at the same time, the rate as a short-run demand, leading to economic growth without inflation.
These examples highlight how there is a clear trade-off between the policy objectives of achieving economic growth and the policy objectives of achieving inflation. In both the short run, as an economy looks to grow, but there is a risk of increasing inflation, and in the long run, as the central bank seeks to control inflation, but there is a risk of a stagnating economy. Thank you very much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed the presentation.
From Bev and Creed, we sign off for the last time.